Hello and welcome back. In Chapter 3, we will create a very cool mortar explosion using grains. Grains is a very powerful tool to have in your arsenal because it gives a very unique look that normal particles usually can't achieve. And before we start, let me show you what I want to achieve so you have a clear idea of where we're going. And what I usually do before I start a project is gather as much reference as I can so I can mimic the effect as closely as possible. Take a look at this reference, for example. So first of all, notice that we can feel a very nice sense of mass and weight. We can also see the individual chunks. And although the sand is separating, we never see these single small particles flying around. And this gives a very distinctive look. Now let's take a look at another example. This is a huge detonation under a very wet sand. And notice how we get these very huge lumps of ground. Again, they start breaking apart, but you never see tiny individual points. You somehow always get these groupings and these lumps that they even fall to the ground and bounce or even break apart more. And this is what I want to achieve. This is very difficult to achieve with simple particles. And this is why I'm using grains for this exercise. So now let me show you the result. So this is the actual simulation. Of course, the dimension here is kind of in between. It's not as small as the first example, but it's also not huge like the second one. So notice here we have a very nice lumping. I really like these shapes. They look like the wet sand that we're getting here in this second example. We have a few tiny points here and there, but they can also be nice if we instance some larger geometry. So let's take a look at how the sand falls. So first of all, notice that we get a little bit of bounce and additional breaking, but we also get this lumping, and you never get like a extremely flat area of points. That would usually be the case with simple particles. So notice here they tend to pile up, and that looks very natural. So now let's together set up the scene to start creating our explosion. So here I have a terrain and a camera. If you have been following along with the building exercise, this is a camera from the scene, and it is also the exact same terrain that I'm using for the demolition of the building. This file will be included in the exercises folder. Okay, so first of all, I will create an empty geometry. So create a geometry node. Let's call this node Mortar Explosion. And I will bring in the geometry from this terrain. So remember, I usually create a null after our main tree. You can select the null, Control C, to copy this node's path, and then go back to your empty geometry. And we will create an object merge node. And here under the object parameter, you can Control V to paste the null's reference. Another thing that I usually do is here under Transform, select Transform into this object. What this option does is, if you have transformation here at the object level, say you scaled this up or down, these transforms will also be taken into account on this object merge. So let's go back to my terrain object, revert the scale, and we can also hide the terrain for now because we now have it in our mortar explosion geometry. So let me make a little bit of space here. I will change the node's color. And now to move along, I won't use the entire geometry because this geometry is huge. Since I am rendering the whole landscape, I created a very big geometry. But for the explosion, we just need a fraction of this geometry. So first of all, let me add a delete node. And I will select by bounding box and delete whatever I don't need. So click here on the bounding volume tab, click enable, and by default you will have bounding box, which is fine. So I'll change the size to 10 meters width and 10 meters depth, and probably also increase the height to 4, and then translate the bounding box more towards the camera. So for now, I will just center the explosion on the camera's view. So I will move it just a little bit more to the right and probably a little bit more towards the camera. Now we want to invert the selection of polygons or primitives. So here under operation, select delete non-selected. Now at some point we will need the particles to collide with this geometry. So what I usually do is extrude the polygons to have some volume. Also, I will need some depth to carve out the pieces that I want to explode. So let's add a poly extrude. Let's extrude this downward about a meter. Make sure that you have the output back option turned on. And also the normals are inverted, so we can add a reverse node. Okay, now I will create a sphere. I will use a sphere to boolean out the parts of the ground that I want to blow up. So I will create a sphere more or less about a meter in diameter. Let's template the terrain. Bring the sphere towards the camera. But before that, let's make sure this is a polygon sphere. I will increase the resolution. You can press spacebar F to frame the sphere. Let's add some UVs. So add a UV texture node. So for now, we can go with polar coordinates. You can press spacebar 5 to check the UVs. So this is in case we want to apply some textures that we most probably will. So go back to the perspective with spacebar 1. And another thing that I want to add is a mountain node, just to make this geometry more irregular. So let me flatten the rock a little bit more. Let's change the name of this transform to scale. So I don't want the crater to go very deep. This is why I'm going to flatten it a bit. Let's change the Y scale, say to 0.4. And I think now we can move it towards the camera. We can add a transform just to center it on its final position. So let's go to the camera view and let's move this towards X and towards C in positive directions. So we may also need to increase the Y. So let's display the terrain so we have a better idea of what's happening. You can press enter on the viewport and select the move tool just to make it easier to move around. Let's say 0.65 in Y and 20 meters in Z. So just make sure that we have a piece of this sphere under the terrain. And more or less it's centered on your camera. So now what we can do is boolean the terrain with a sphere. So let's add a boolean node. Let's connect the terrain to the first input, the sphere to the second input. And by default, the boolean will create an intersection of both geometries, which is fine. We will use this part, but I also need the terrain with the crater. So let's change the operation to subtract. The default is A minus B, so A will be the first input, B will be the second input. So this is fine. One important thing that I always do is look for B inside A. This is a group of primitives that will be created, and it's basically where the B geometry intersects or touches the A geometry. And let me show you what I mean. I'll create a blast, connect it below the boolean, and blast everything except B inside A. So here you can see the group. I usually save this group, for example, to add textures or to create a special collision object. In most of the cases, it will be useful. So make a habit of turning this group on. Now I will copy this boolean, paste it here to the right. And for this boolean, I do want the intersect. So change the operation type to intersect. And now we should be ready to continue. Let's add a few nulls. Let's call this one out terrain. Let's change the color to black. And we can copy and paste the null. Change the name to out chunk. So we can delete this node now. And we're ready to create our grain source.